Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Max Fisher. Max is someone that has come to us by way of some of our previous Access Chats, and I love how the community brings everything together. So Max is part of Deborah's Billion Strong community, and we're going to be talking about identity today, and Billion Strong is all about disability, positive identity. Max is a deafblind, disabled, genderqueer scientist working in the field of nanomedicine. And so, Max, that sounds like you're, as rare as a needle in a haystack. You're hitting loads of different intersections. So, tell us about yourself and your journey into the sort of disability advocacy space and how you ended up on here today, connected with us, and let's take it from there. Welcome.
Hi. So that is a big question. I will try and give you the cliff notes. So I started identifying as chronically ill in my sort of mid-teens. It's when I started developing like chronic pain, and there was a whole journey of trying to figure out like what it was, why it was happening, what do I do about it. And it was many years before I actually got any form of diagnosis. But joining the chronic illness community as someone undiagnosed but very much suffering, it led me into advocacy and activism because we need a voice. Because there are so many of us just stuck in the house in too much pain to do anything, and no one is hearing us out. Like doctors are just saying it's like depression, anxiety, and all that kind of thing. So I very quickly started like posting about it and being open about it and being like, this hurts all of the time. And it also sucks eggs that I can't get out of bed because it hurts. Like I would much rather be studying right now, but I physically can't do it. So I sort of struggled throughout school. My grades kind of dropped a little bit, but then there was also some undiagnosed neurodivergence going on in there. I heavily identify with that formerly gifted kid that then suddenly hit a cut-off point where grades were no longer magically excellent and the struggles kind of continued. So I eventually went to university. I studied pharmacology, got a bachelor's and a master's in that. And while I was at uni, I managed to like work through a lot of the health issues and managed to start getting diagnosed with things. So it ended up being Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, causing all of my chronic pain, and then the offshoot or secondary condition, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, that went along with that. That has been sort of diagnosed 3 times because I keep getting sent back to the GP, but that's another story. And I became a wheelchair user about halfway through university just because I realized that trying to struggle and like walk my way there and not making it 9 times out of 10 was worse than actually using a mobility aid. Turns out wheelchairs are not the worst thing in the world. And it got me so much of my independence back. But there were more barriers that came with that. So there were swings and roundabouts. So I started wheelchair basketball, became a wheelchair basketball coach, and just sort of kept doing advocacy like, hey, you've got to put a ramp in, stop turning the lifts off after 5 p.m. because we don't stop being disabled after 5. And yeah, it's just sort of grown from there, I guess. And then unemployment more. I made lots of YouTube videos being like, disability is cool. And I have another rare condition called cold urticaria, and that got some media attention in 2019, pre-COVID, because I wear a face mask outside, because if I breathe cold air, my throat swells up, and that's not very fun. So started making videos about that, and then branched out into like queerness and stuff.
Okay. Gosh, so you said where do we start, and now where do I come back in? So, so we've had over the years about 450 different people appear, but one of the recurring themes is around chronic pain and how people aren't believed.
Mm-hmm.
Another recurring theme is the amount of people that have EDS that are not believed and that are not diagnosed. And then also quite a number of the people in the EDS community are also neurodivergent and gender fluid.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting that these patterns are occurring on Access Chat in our audience, and it's not that I'm going out there going, you know what, I need to find another EDS gender fluid chronic pain.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think there's definitely a study in that, but I think one of my theories is that because queer folk sort of know what it's like to be different, we notice things in our body a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So we're more likely to speak up because we know that we have that outsider feeling. Whereas people who've never experienced that, they tend to sit on it. So they might be in incredible amounts of pain, but they're not talking about it. They're not doing the journey because they recognize that they feel outside, but they don't know what to do about it. Whereas lots of neurodivergent people, lots of queer people, or the other way around, if you were already disabled and then sexuality, boom, you're kind of already there. You've done the journey once, and you're just like, well, I guess we're doing this again.
Yeah.
Like the first step is always the hardest. The second one, less so.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think there's multiple booms.
It's definitely more to it than that, but that's one of my ideas.
Yes, but I do think that having been diagnosed with dyslexia and even later with ADHD, and having been told that I was depressed and stuff for that, I think
I had the worst phone call with a GP the other day. I thought I was anemic because, spoiler alert, I was anemic. But like on the phone, she was like, "Do you think you might be depressed?" And it was like 3 questions in. I was like, "Why are you? How did you get there so fast?"
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm tired all of the time. And then she did a blood test, and I wasn't quite anemic. So, we do know our bodies sometimes.
Yes, yeah, I think we do. But where I was going with that sense of otherness, they're definitely the first time that you get a diagnosis, you feel an explanation for some of that otherness, and then as you go through it again, it's less of a trauma and more of a relief.
Yes,
in terms of you're able to come to terms.
100%.
Yeah. So and yes, we do advocate, but I advocate for this stuff. Once you've been through it, you want other people's journeys to be easier.
Exactly that. And that is exactly why I do everything I do, is because I don't think people should, just because I suffered, that doesn't mean other people should. Like, if I can make it easier for somebody, damn right, I'm going to try.
Yeah, good.
I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So, of all of these different areas, so we quite often, once you've done that and you start advocating, that then means that there's lots of interactions with other people. So you went on a journey within your own workplace as well. So you got a job. You then started up an ERG. So tell us about your experience of starting up and running an employee network.
Yeah, so this is like one of the highlights of my career so far. Even though it ended sort of on a sour note, it's still one of the most wonderful things that I got to do as much as I did. So when I started employment with my previous employer, one of the first things I did was write like an all company email talking about like Deaf Awareness Week. And I'm like, "Hi, I'm Max. I'm your newest deaf employee. Here's sort of some tips on how to speak to deaf people. And, please know that I'm not being rude if I ignore you, because I probably just didn't hear you." And that email just got to the right people immediately because it was all company, so they all read it. And then months and months later, like I think it was like 10 months later, I had an email from someone quite high up in the company being like, "Hey, we're thinking of starting a disability ERG, and we can't think of anybody better to help run it. There's this other person who wants to get involved, so let's all have a chat together." And then it just kind of spiraled from there, of just like, I was in from the moment they said disability group, I was in. And we put in a lot of work to get it to launch, and like all of the logistics, like logos, design, how are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? What's the launch going to be? And someone suggested, like, let's have a speaker. Who can we think of? And I was like, well, if we don't have a budget, that's going to be quite hard. I could speak. And I did. And I just talked about, I sort of rambled a bit and never really scripted it, which is something I need to work on. But I was just talking about, like, growing up being told, like, yeah, you should be a scientist, be really strong, have a good career. And then the moment I was disabled, everyone was like, oh, no, I don't think you could do that anymore. Well, what's your plan now? And then having like a 3.5-year unemployment gap because employees were scared of disabilities. And then finally getting my job because someone talked me up who already worked there. And then I managed to sell myself well in the interview. I just talked about that. And then the stuff about like being undiagnosed, going through a diagnosis, having multiple diagnoses. I just talked about my life and sort of being a bit kind of vulnerable with everybody. And then the feedback that I got from that was like so heartwarming, because there were employees that I'd walk past every day and they'd just be like, I had no idea. Thank you for sharing. And we got to help people as well. So there were people that came to the launch that were not, they didn't identify as disabled, but they had problems, like work-related problems, like science-related problems that could only really be solved by someone with an experience of blindness. And they were just like, this is really weird, but here's the problem we're having. And I was able to be like, oh, here's many potential solutions. Good luck. We also had some like one-to-one, we gave some one-to-one support for other disabled people within the company who were just like, I don't know how to progress my career because I'm autistic and I don't understand the social aspect of it. I don't know how to ask. So we were able to like link them up with relevant people to like get them started, but also give them a space to be like, this is how I feel about my disabilities. No one else gets it, but we did.
Which is very powerful.
Yay.
I mean, you have such a big story, Max. It's interesting. I love listening to you talk about your experience, but at the same time, your life experience shows employers the nuances of being human. And I always am saying, disability is just part of being human. Why do we make it a big deal about it? Why don't we just include all humans anyway? But but at the same time, the nuanced, complicated issues involved with it. It's like a brand really wanting to do the right thing, and they see you, for example, or an employee like you, and they're like, all right, we could do even better by our employees and others, and really having the will to want to do the right thing, but not always having the budget, especially in these ridiculously crazy times.
Yes.
And so one thing I wanted to do was make sure that the audience got to meet you and hear what you're saying, and to really think of the nuances associated with what Max is saying, especially since she is representing different lived experiences and the uniqueness of being a human being. So, but one thing I would be curious about, because I think it's really hard right now for employers, maybe even a little bit harder in some way for corporate employers. Not that I'm feeling sorry for corporations right now. I still think they need to really pick up the be better thing. But at the same time, I think society sends, employers so many mixed messages, and society says, you better solve all these problems we all didn't solve, but you better solve it now in your workforce. So one thing I think might be helpful for the audience is, what would you advise that they do, Max, when they're really, and this is another big question, okay? So you take it wherever you want, but
Perfect.
I believe employers are trying. I believe they're trying. They're trying to be sensitive about it. They're trying to understand all these different moving parts. They hear from people like you, Max, and I know they're hearing what we heard, in that, wow, she has all this innovation and creativeness and great answers. wow, this is the kind of employee we want. But I often feel they just don't know how to really include diverse humans. And I also want to make another point while you think about this, in that I also just want to show you love and empathy for your chronic pain. My beautiful daughter Sarah, born with Down syndrome, she lives with chronic pain, and it has been so difficult. And when I sometimes are like, Sarah, you can be nicer, you know, it's hard sometimes to be nice when you feel really bad. And so I just am so empathetic over anyone that's walking that kind of pain, because my husband did, and now Sarah is, and it is affecting my life as her mother, somebody that loves her, and as one of her primary caregivers. So I just don't think we can underestimate how much chronic pain is hurting all of us. So I just wanted to toss that out to you too, and send you some love on that part as well. And thank you, Max, for what you're doing.
Yay. But yeah, I think employers often view disabled people as like a box ticking exercise. There's like because I think diversity monitoring has got quite popular recently. And while obviously it is good to make sure that you have a diverse workforce, I think using it as a box ticking exercise just to say, yes, our workforce is diverse, is not entirely helpful. Because the amount of friends I have who are disabled and they feel like a diversity hire because when they show up, the workforce is not prepared for them to be exactly who they are and exactly as disabled as they are. Like they'll hire a wheelchair user, but their lift will be broken. There'll be a step at the entrance. They've done like a remote interview to be like, yeah, work from home is fine. And then they demand that you show up to the office every day. And then they get grumpy when you're like, I actually can't show up to the office today. Like I physically cannot get in the door. So I think they just need to start seeing disabled people as people. I don't normally encourage people to use terms like people with disabilities, because if you have to remember that I am a person first, that's not ideal. But I think sometimes for Employer 101, that's the way it has to be, because they just forget that we're people with other interests. Like I have other interests outside of being a queer person and being disabled and being deafblind and doing my advocacy. Not once have I been asked what else I do. And that's not a dig at anyone here, because that's why we're here to talk about. But just even like in my day-to-day life, when it's like, oh, how was your weekend? It's like, oh, did you get up to anything? Like it's always like, you know, what did you do this time? Kind of thing, like with an elbow nudge. Like I am an entire person, and science is a big part of that, because I love science and I love the problem solving side of things. I love the hands-on cell culture. So I'm a cell biologist mostly, and I really love the hands-on working with cells and being able to figure out why are my cells in my flask not happy, and then making them happy, even though they've not told me anything. I'm just sort of picking up on what they need, I guess. But I really love that part of it. And like being a disabled scientist sometimes means I have to do it a little bit differently. And so many employers think that they have to figure out how I can do science. And it's not so much the case. We have to work together to make it accessible and ensure that I am able to do it correctly, but I'm also able to do it in a way that's accessible to me. So I am used to living with my disabilities. They are not.
No.
It helps if they take like a slight backseat to be like, okay, so this is how you split cells, but you take the lead on how you get up to the hood. How do you get your arms in? How do you go and get all of the bits of kit that you need? Like it's a partnership and it's teamwork always.
So I just wanted to. I know Antonio's got a question, and applaud you for the way that you've talked about that. I run the sort of all of the sort of policy and stuff for a large multinational on the topics, and we're in 70 odd countries, and so the language around disability is varied and difficult, fraught with contradictions and so on. I think that you said actually sometimes I just have to admit that we probably have to use person first language and persons with disabilities so that we remind people of our humanity. And I think that is the case, and that sometimes, and so we took a view that we follow the United Nations language as much as possible, because you know what, they're UN, they've done a lot of research, they've worked with the DPOs and everything else. Let's not reinvent the wheel. At the same time, individuals, might choose to identify different ways, and we need to make sure that they have that respect. But I think that sometimes we get het up as advocates about people using person-first language, particularly in certain communities, particularly in the neurodivergent community, and the instinct is to go and send a verbal right hook or a snarky tweet, and I think you explained it perfectly by saying, actually, sometimes we do just need to remind people of our humanity. So thank you for that, and I'll hand over to Antonio.
No, I just want to talk about, honesty and being honest within organizations. Sometimes we need to question, if organizations who are doing things under the radar, they don't really talk much about disability, they might not talk much about inclusion. So people have some expectations, but they are doing it under the radar. They are not actively promoting. So they are doing it in a kind of a subtle way. On the other end, we have other organizations who are very vocal, but then they disappoint because people say, "Oh, it's so good. It's really wonderful to see all this taking place in our big glass building head office. But me, I'm here in the south or in the different hemisphere, and this doesn't really reach me. They're all happy there, but here I can't even talk with my manager about disability because otherwise I'll be under the radar of HR." So how do we stand in terms of honesty when we have conversations about disability and inclusion?
Good question. I think honesty about disability really benefits everybody. So I try to be honest about it in my interviews to make sure that if they are not happy with a disabled person, that they don't hire a disabled person, because then my life will be miserable. I don't really care about how the company feels. I care about how much harder they're going to make my life for me. And I think there's a lot of organizations that are all bark and no bite. So they post all over social media about diversity is good. We're so diverse, as you were saying. And then when you get in the company, it's like, it's not really that diverse. You've hired like 2 disabled people, a gay man, and 3 people of color. Everyone else is white, cisgender, able-bodied, straight, etc. And it's like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of diversity, where just having a few people who are a little bit different or who are a little bit quirky, as some people call me, makes you a diverse workforce. And that's not diversity at all. Diversity isn't screaming it from the rooftops and being like, we're diverse. It's actually putting your money where your mouth is and actually just being diverse, because diversity is so normal. Like if you pick like 15 random people, they're all going to be diverse in some way. Yeah. Like if I put names into a hat and I drew some names, they're all going to have, some of them will be gay, some of them might be trans, some of them will be disabled. Like it's just so normal to be different. And a lot of companies see it as abnormal to be different, but will hire you anyway. Whereas companies need to move more towards just like, okay, yeah, you have a disability, but like that's totally normal and fine. How can we help?
Well, I don't usually do this, but as you were talking, I wrote down 3 different quotes from you, which I'm going to put out definitely on LinkedIn and Twitter. Honesty about disabilities benefit everyone. Mm-hmm. Wow, is that so powerful? Disability is so normal. And also, It's normal to be different. What is going on? And this is just so normal to do all this stuff, and yet we've made you definitely a unicorn.
Yeah, that
Thank you.
does seem to happen a lot. I do tick quite a lot of boxes, but it's not because I'm trying. That's just how the
Right.
cards fell. It's just happened. I just happen to be a gay person who is non-binary, who is also disabled, whose ears don't work, whose eyes don't really work, who likes science. That's just how it's fell. And I love that. It's such a rich life that I have. Like, look at all these wonderful things that I get to do.
Right.
No, I've been, seriously looking at the numbers and references about the number of disabled people, and apparently there's a number about 15% of the population around. But if you dive deep in other numbers, you realize how absurd that number is.
Mhm.
Because if you just look at the number of people that wear something like this
Yes.
around the world, you have about 65%
Mhm.
of people around the world, and more or less, the number might slightly diverge by country regarding the age. And then on the top of that, you have people who are deaf, another number. So it's basically impossible that we can claim that only 15% of the population has a
Exactly.
disability. Probably it's the other way around.
Right.
No?
I think you're
So,
right.
yeah. So it's so and this type of numbers, they end up contributing to the way how many people see the community. Oh, 15%. And we have even very interesting cases. I think Boston Consulting released did a survey, and then people were usually assuming, oh, 5% of 8% of my workforce has a disability, and then they end up realizing, oh, it's 25, it's 30%.
Mhm.
So I think we need to look more seriously to the numbers, because they are creating a lot of misunderstandings in the
Yes.
way how we read the world.
Absolutely. Like, I think the word disability has been taken so like out of proportion because people think that being disabled is the worst thing you can ever be. Therefore, to be disabled, you must have one of the worst conditions ever. You must have to use the mobility aid that's reserved for the worst sufferers. And it isn't like that at all. Disability, it's not the worst thing you can be, for a start. And it's so broad. Like, people are like, oh, I have a chronic illness, but I'm not disabled though. And I'm like, okay, but what do you mean by that? And they're just like, well, I'm not really chronically ill enough. I'm like,
Right.
no, you are. Like, you are disabled enough to use the term disabled. Like, that's just what it is. It's just an adjective. It's like my hair is green, but some of these parts, they're like yellow and they're blue at the back. That doesn't mean that I'm not green enough to call myself someone with green hair. It's something
I
that I've
love that analogy.
sort of
That's a
struggled
wonderful
with
analogy.
a lot, because people, when I say like, oh, I'm disabled, people are like, but you don't look disabled. I'm like, what does that look like? Or I say, oh, I'm deafblind, and they go like, but you don't look it. And I'm like, great, you look it to me because I can't fucking see you.
So thank you for F-bombing. It's usually me that does it.
I'm so sorry. I forgot to check.
No, don't be sorry. We love it.
And by the way, we will not be starring it in the
Perfect.
in the captions. We will leave it.
The best kind. Deaf people shouldn't have to guess which swear word I said.
No,
They deserve to
Thank
know.
you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Can we be
The
accessible?
infantilization of disabled people also
Exactly.
needs to stop. Like,
I
I'm an
feel
adult
fine.
deaf person. I don't need to be censored.
No. So I think, oh gosh, so many things here. So many things. So when I talk about my own organisation, we are, as you've already mentioned, diverse by our very existence. We're in 70 countries, 110,000 people. The diversity is there by default, but it's our choice to be inclusive, right? And I think that, you know, that everyone is focused on diversity and metrics and not enough on culture and attitudes and how we treat people. Now, there are certain things where you do need to measure, because businesses operate on a sort of, it doesn't get measured, doesn't get done kind of ethos. But at the same time, you know, be careful about what you choose to measure.
Yeah, it's like, measure it so that you know that you're
Yeah.
doing it, but don't do it for the measurement.
Ooh.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's choose which sentence we want to
Deborah's
finish.
got a pen running out as I'm talking.
Yeah.
I got another quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going
So
to follow Max around all day and just get quotes from her.
yeah.
But that happens more than I can even say.
So I mean, I think that changing culture change and mindset change is so integral to what we're doing, which is why we need people like yourself that are willing to talk about this coherently, willing to also see things from the other perspective, because I think that the fact that you are able to see that other people might need that reminder about in the language and accept something that you would prefer not to, but understand that it's a vehicle.
I would prefer they just saw me as a person from the off.
No,
Like
absolutely,
maybe
but-
they would just describe me slightly differently instead of just
Yeah.
being like, oh, that's Max. They're a disabled person. Like sometimes
They
I
are
just
a
want to be like
disabled
Max.
person. Yeah,
But like
they tick our diversity boxes. They contribute to our stats in these three columns.
exactly. Like sometimes we get so caught up on the language. So for example, at university, we'll call it the trans officer. It's a much longer name. We were campaigning for some gender neutral toilets. We just wanted like some to be available, like the single use ones that are just they're just like a room with one toilet in it, and like the door locks and like they were like, yeah, it's for like, okay, we can do that. What should we put on the door? And the decision about what language and what picture we would put on the door held the project up by at least a year. I think I was arguing just put toilet on it for like 3 years that I was there. And they were like, oh, but it's a bit vulgar. And I'm like, but it's... And then I was just like, why don't you just put like a picture of a toilet or just like WC or like, I don't even care. Like the stick figures where they've got like one that's the man and one that's the woman, just put both. And they're like, that might be a bit vague. And I'm like,
poop emoji.
so that's too vague and too specific. Like, I don't care. I know it's not ideal that we are representing two sexes and, non-binary people don't fit either of those. Maybe the non-binary person identifies as the line in the middle of them. I don't care. I just want somewhere that I can go pee. And I think they got so like hung up on the language. I'm like, you're missing the entire point.
Yes.
I don't want to pee in bathroom 9 3/4. I just want to go. Stop arguing with me about the
Maybe that was quite a good name, place to go to pee. That's it.
Yes, that would work too. Oh, but then can you only pee or can you do the other thing? Like,
That's why I was suggesting you need the poop emoji.
I was going to say that. We should just put the poop emoji.
Yeah. Excellent. I think that's a perfect ending to this podcast. So, on that
Someone's
note,
got to stop me because otherwise I never will.
on that note, I need to thank my clear text and Amazon for keeping this captioned on our app. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation with poop emojis, so long as they're all accurately described with image descriptions and everything else on X.
Perfect.